What if I told you that your individual personality, the very sense of self you believe defines who you are, is actually nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion orchestrated by invisible forces that have been shaping human behavior for millennia? What if every decision you think you make freely, every emotion you experience as uniquely yours, every dream that visits you in the night, is actually the result of ancient psychological patterns called archetypes that exist in the deepest layers of your unconscious mind? You see, we've been conditioned to believe that we are separate, individual beings making conscious choices based on reason and personal experience. But this couldn't be further from the truth. These archetypal forces don't just influence you, they possess you, they drive you, they make your decisions for you, while you remain completely unaware of their presence. The hero's journey you feel compelled to embark upon, the mother's protective instincts that overwhelm you, the shadow's dark impulses you try to suppress, these aren't your personal quirks or individual traits. They are universal patterns of human experience that have been controlling our species since consciousness first emerged from the primordial depths of the psyche. Right now, as you process these words, archetypes are actively shaping your thoughts, your emotional responses, even your resistance to what I'm telling you. The question isn't whether you're being controlled by these forces. The question is whether you'll continue to remain unconscious of their influence. Most people don't realize they're living their entire lives as unconscious puppets, dancing to the rhythm of archetypal patterns they never chose and can't see. They believe they're making independent decisions, pursuing their own goals, expressing their authentic personalities, when in reality, they're simply enacting the same primordial dramas that have played out across human civilization for thousands of years. Let me show you exactly how trapped most people are. First, they experience what I call archetypal possession without ever recognizing it. One moment they're calm and rational, the next they're consumed by inexplicable rage, overwhelming love, or paralyzing fear, and they have no idea that ancient patterns in their unconscious mind have just taken control of their emotional and behavioral responses. They'll rationalize these experiences afterward, create stories about why they acted that way, but they never see the archetypal puppet strings pulling their psychological levers. Second, they remain stuck in repetitive life patterns that feel personally meaningful, but are actually universal templates. The same relationship dynamics, the same career struggles, the same spiritual seeking, playing out again and again, because they're unconsciously following archetypal scripts written in the collective unconscious. They think they're living unique, individual lives, but they're really just variations on the same basic human themes that have existed since the dawn of consciousness. Third, they project these archetypal contents onto other people and external situations, creating a distorted reality where they see gods and demons, heroes and villains, perfect lovers and evil enemies, but never recognize these as aspects of their own unconscious psychological structure. This leads to endless conflicts, disappointing relationships, and a persistent feeling that the world is somehow against them, when really they're seeing their own internal archetypal dynamics reflected in everything around them. Fourth, they experience what feels like spiritual emptiness or psychological fragmentation because they've lost connection with the deeper source of meaning that these archetypes represent. Modern civilization has taught us to identify only with our conscious ego, dismissing the vast, unconscious realms where these powerful forces reside, leaving people feeling cut off from the numinous experiences that give life its deeper significance. Fifth, they attempt to solve their problems using only conscious, rational approaches, therapy that only addresses surface symptoms, self-help that tries to modify behavior without understanding the underlying archetypal dynamics, spiritual practices that ignore the psychological foundations of transcendent experience. These approaches might provide temporary relief, but they never address the deeper archetypal patterns that continue generating the same problems over and over again. The hidden costs of remaining unconscious of these archetypal forces are staggering. People spend decades in therapy trying to resolve issues that could be transformed in months if they understood the archetypal dynamics involved. They waste enormous amounts of energy fighting against their own psychological nature instead of learning to work with these powerful forces. They miss opportunities for genuine individuation and psychological development because they're trapped in unconscious identification with partial archetypal patterns. Most tragically, they never experience the profound sense of meaning and purpose that comes from conscious relationship with these deep sources of human wisdom and creativity. Why do conventional approaches fail so miserably? Because they treat symptoms instead of addressing the archetypal roots. Psychology tries to analyze problems from the limited perspective of personal history and conscious experience, completely ignoring the transpersonal dimensions where these patterns originate. Religion offers connection to archetypal energies, but often in rigid, dogmatic forms that prevent genuine psychological integration. Self-help promises quick fixes that bypass the deep transformational work required to establish conscious relationship with unconscious contents. None of these approaches recognize that the archetypes are not problems to be solved, but powerful allies to be understood and integrated. But here's what changes everything. I'm going to share with you 5 scientifically grounded methods for developing conscious relationship with archetypal forces that can completely transform how you experience yourself and your life. These aren't abstract philosophical concepts or wishful thinking. They're practical techniques based on decades of clinical observation and research into the structure and dynamics of the human psyche. What I've discovered through my work with thousands of patients is that there are specific, reliable ways to identify archetypal patterns in your own psyche, establish conscious dialogue with these forces, and integrate their wisdom in ways that enhance rather than possess your conscious personality. The most successful people I've worked with, those who achieve genuine psychological maturity and live with deep sense of purpose, all share one common characteristic: they've learned to recognize and work consciously with the archetypal dimensions of their experience. The research coming out of neuroscience and depth psychology confirms what I observed clinically decades ago. The human brain contains universal pattern recognition systems that respond to specific archetypal configurations. Dr. Antonio Damasio's work on embodied cognition, the research on mirror neurons by Giacomo Rizzolatti, Joseph Campbell's comparative mythology studies, all of this scientific validation supports the existence of these deep psychological structures that influence human behavior across cultures and throughout history. What separates those who remain unconsciously controlled by archetypal forces from those who develop conscious relationship with them isn't intelligence, education, or willpower. It's specific knowledge and practical skills for navigating the depths of the psyche. Those who master these skills report experiencing life with unprecedented clarity, creativity, and sense of meaning. They no longer feel victimized by their emotions or confused by their motivations. They develop what I call archetypal literacy, the ability to read the symbolic language of the unconscious and translate archetypal wisdom into conscious, practical application. Once you understand how to work with these forces consciously, you'll never experience psychological problems the same way again. Instead of seeing symptoms as personal failings or random occurrences, you'll recognize them as invitations from specific archetypal contents that want to be integrated into your conscious personality. You'll stop wasting energy fighting against your own psychological nature and start using that same energy for creative expression and meaningful contribution to the world. The journey I am about to take you on will fundamentally change how you understand yourself, your relationships, and your place in the larger patterns of human experience. You're about to discover that what you thought were your personal limitations are actually doorways to profound sources of strength and wisdom. Let me introduce you to the first foundational principle that most people completely misunderstand about archetypal forces. They believe archetypes are abstract philosophical concepts or mythological curiosities, when in reality they are living psychological organs that function as consistently and predictably as your heart or liver. Think of your psyche like a vast underground river system. On the surface, you see only the small streams of conscious thought and deliberate action, but beneath the surface, massive currents of archetypal energy flow through deep channels carved by millions of years of human experience. These aren't metaphorical streams, they're actual neural networks, energetic patterns, and behavioral templates that shape your responses to life with the same reliability that gravity shapes the movement of water. Consider this analogy: just as your body contains organs that perform specific biological functions without conscious direction, your heart pumps blood, your lungs process oxygen, your liver filters toxins, your psyche contains archetypal organs that perform specific psychological functions. The mother archetype regulates nurturing and protective responses. The hero archetype organizes goal-directed behavior and obstacle-overcoming strategies. The wise old man provides access to accumulated knowledge and guidance. These aren't poetic metaphors, they're functional psychological structures that operate whether you're aware of them or not. Here's another way to understand this. Imagine your unconscious mind as a sophisticated computer operating system running multiple programs simultaneously. Your conscious mind is like the interface you see on the screen. It seems to be in control, making choices and directing activity. But underneath, the archetypal programs are actually running all the core functions. They're processing sensory input, managing emotional responses, generating behavioral options, creating meaning from experience, and maintaining psychological stability. Most people never realize that what they think of as their conscious personality is really just the user interface for these deeper archetypal operating systems. The neuroscientific evidence for this is overwhelming. Researchers have identified specific brain regions that activate in response to archetypal stimuli, universal patterns that trigger consistent neural responses across different cultures and individuals. When people view images related to the mother archetype, for example, specific areas of the limbic system activate in predictable ways. When confronted with hero archetype triggers, reward pathways in the brain light up with remarkable consistency. These responses happen faster than conscious recognition, indicating that archetypal recognition occurs at preconscious levels of neural processing. But here's what most people miss about this scientific validation. They think understanding the mechanics makes the experience less meaningful, when actually it makes conscious relationship with archetypal forces more precise and powerful. When you understand exactly how these patterns function in your nervous system, you can work with them more skillfully instead of being unconsciously driven by them. Now let me show you what happens when people remain unconscious of these archetypal dynamics. They experience what I call negative archetypal manifestation, where the creative and organizing power of these patterns becomes destructive because it's not integrated with conscious awareness. A person unconsciously possessed by the hero archetype might become an obsessive workaholic, sacrificing relationships and health in pursuit of achievements that never satisfy. Someone unconsciously identified with the mother might become smothering and manipulative, using caregiving as a form of control. The shadow archetype, when unrecognized, projects all the disowned aspects of personality onto other people, creating enemies and conflicts that are really internal psychological dramas being acted out in external relationships. Think about a time when you felt completely overwhelmed by an emotion that seemed to come from nowhere: sudden rage, inexplicable sadness, overwhelming anxiety. In those moments, you weren't experiencing a personal emotional response, you were experiencing archetypal possession. A deep pattern in your unconscious had been triggered by some external stimulus, and because you didn't recognize what was happening, the archetypal energy flooded your consciousness without any organizing framework to contain or direct it constructively. The second crucial principle that transforms everything is recognizing that what most people call their personality is actually a collection of unconscious identifications with partial archetypal patterns, and true psychological maturity requires developing what I call archetypal fluidity, the ability to consciously access different archetypal perspectives as situations require. Most people build their sense of identity around one or two dominant archetypal patterns and then spend their entire lives defending this limited self-concept against experiences that don't fit. They might identify strongly with the hero archetype and feel lost or depressed when life requires them to be receptive or nurturing. Or they might identify with the innocent archetype and feel overwhelmed when situations demand assertiveness or confrontation. This archetypal rigidity creates enormous psychological suffering because it cuts them off from the full range of human responses available through the complete archetypal spectrum. The conventional approach to personality development encourages this rigidity by teaching people to know themselves in ways that actually limit psychological flexibility. Popular psychology tells you to identify your strengths, discover your personality type, find your authentic self. All approaches that encourage identification with fixed patterns rather than developing the capacity to consciously embody different archetypal energies as life circumstances require. But here's the psychological mechanism that changes everything. What we call personality is really just habitual activation of particular neural networks associated with specific archetypal configurations. These networks become dominant through repetition and reinforcement, creating the illusion of a fixed self. But neuroscience has proven that the brain remains plastic throughout life. New neural pathways can be developed, dormant networks can be reactivated, and the relative dominance of different systems can be consciously modified through specific practices. The people who achieve genuine psychological maturity understand this plasticity and develop what I call archetypal sovereignty, the ability to consciously choose which archetypal perspective to embody in any given situation. They don't identify with any single pattern, instead, they develop a flexible, observing consciousness that can access the wisdom and energy of different archetypes as needed. When the situation calls for protective strengths, they can embody the warrior. When nurturing is needed, they can access the mother. When creative innovation is required, they can channel the artist or inventor archetypes. This isn't about becoming a different person or losing your authentic self. It's about discovering that your authentic self is actually much larger and more multifaceted than the limited archetypal patterns you've been unconsciously identified with. Most people experience only a tiny fraction of their full psychological potential because they remain trapped in narrow archetypal identifications formed during childhood and reinforced by social conditioning. The mental blocks that prevent this development are predictable and can be systematically addressed. First, there's the fear of losing control. People worry that if they stop identifying with familiar patterns, they'll lose their sense of identity or direction. Second, there's the misconception that archetypal work is dangerous or potentially destabilizing, that exploring unconscious contents might unleash forces they can't handle. Third, there's the belief that psychological change requires years of difficult inner work when actually specific techniques can create rapid shifts in archetypal accessibility. The mental exercise I want you to try right now is what I call archetypal perspective taking. Choose a current challenge or relationship difficulty you're experiencing. Now, instead of approaching it from your usual mental framework, imagine how different archetypal perspectives might view this situation. How would the wise old man understand this challenge? What would the innocent see that you're missing? How might the warrior approach this differently than the lover? What solutions become visible from the magician's perspective that aren't apparent from your ordinary consciousness? This simple practice begins developing the neural flexibility required for archetypal fluency. Each time you consciously shift perspectives, you're strengthening the observing consciousness that can move fluidly between different archetypal states rather than being unconsciously possessed by them. The third method I want to share with you is a specific technique that elite performers across every field use, often without realizing they're working with archetypal forces. Deliberate archetypal embodiment for peak performance and creative breakthrough. Watch any world-class athlete during competition, any master artist during creation, any exceptional leader during crisis, and you'll observe something remarkable. They're not operating from their ordinary personality. They're channeling specific archetypal energies with complete focus and commitment. Michael Jordan embodying the warrior archetype during basketball games. Marie Curie channeling the magician archetype during scientific research. Martin Luther King embodying the sage and prophet archetype during social transformation. These individuals achieved extraordinary results not just through talent and practice, but through conscious or unconscious alignment with archetypal forces that amplified their capabilities far beyond ordinary human limitations. The brain science behind this phenomenon is fascinating. When someone fully embodies an archetypal pattern, their neural activity shifts dramatically. Brain scans show increased coherence between different regions, enhanced access to implicit memory networks, and activation of what neuroscientists call flow states, optimal performance configurations, where conscious interference is minimized and deeper capabilities can emerge. The archetypal pattern provides an organizing framework that aligns all psychological resources towards specific outcomes with unprecedented efficiency. Dr. Arne Dietrich's research on transient hypofrontality demonstrates that peak performance states involve temporary suppression of the brain's default mode network. The chattering, self-critical, analytically minded consciousness that usually dominates awareness. When this network goes offline, deeper, more integrated systems can take control. What Dietrich doesn't recognize, but what becomes obvious from an archetypal perspective, is that these deeper systems are the neural correlates of archetypal patterns that have been organizing human behavior and capability for millennia. Here's the step-by-step process for accessing this capability consciously. First, identify the specific outcome you want to achieve and determine which archetypal energy is most aligned with that goal. Need to overcome obstacles and achieve a challenging objective. The hero archetype provides that organizing framework. Want to create something beautiful or innovative. The artist or inventor archetypes offer those capabilities. Need to guide or heal others. The teacher, healer, or wise woman archetypes contain those resources. Second, study the characteristics, behaviors, and mental patterns associated with your chosen archetype. Read mythology, watch films, observe real people who embody this energy successfully. You're not copying surface behaviors, you're learning to recognize the deeper psychological signature of this archetypal pattern so you can activate it authentically within your own psyche. Third, create a specific ritual or practice for transitioning from ordinary consciousness into archetypal embodiment. This might involve physical postures, breathing patterns, visualization techniques, or symbolic objects that help signal to your unconscious mind that you're shifting into a different operating mode. Elite athletes use pre-competition rituals for exactly this purpose. They're unconsciously triggering archetypal states that optimize their performance capabilities. Fourth, practice maintaining archetypal coherence under pressure. Start with low-stakes situations and gradually increase the challenge level as your capacity develops. The key is learning to sustain the archetypal perspective even when ordinary consciousness tries to reassert control through self-doubt, analysis, or distraction. The most common mistakes people make with this technique stem from trying to force or fake archetypal embodiment instead of allowing genuine activation to occur. Archetypal energy can't be manufactured through willpower. It emerges when you create the right psychological conditions and then get your ego mind out of the way. Another mistake is choosing archetypes based on what you think you should embody rather than what genuinely resonates with your deeper nature and current life circumstances. Start practicing this immediately with something simple but meaningful in your daily life. Choose one specific activity. Could be a work presentation, a difficult conversation, a creative project, or even something as basic as cleaning your house, and approach it from a clear archetypal perspective. Notice how differently you feel, think, and perform when you're operating from this deeper organizational framework rather than your ordinary scattered consciousness. The fourth method is a systematic process for what I call archetypal mapping, identifying and integrating the specific archetypal patterns that are currently active in your psychological system, both conscious and unconscious. Most people live with a chaotic mix of archetypal influences that they never examine or organize consciously. Partial hero patterns conflict with underdeveloped lover energies. Shadow materials project onto external relationships while wise old man contents remain inaccessible. This creates internal confusion, emotional volatility, and behavioral inconsistency because different archetypal systems are pulling consciousness in contradictory directions without any overarching integration. The systematic approach I've developed through decades of clinical work creates what I call archetypal coherence, a conscious understanding of which patterns are dominant, which are underdeveloped, which are in conflict, and how to establish harmonious relationship between different archetypal contents within your psychological system. The technical mechanism underlying this process involves what neuroscientists call memory reconsolidation, the brain's ability to update existing neural networks by bringing them into conscious awareness and pairing them with new information. When archetypal patterns are unconscious, they operate autonomously and resist modification. but when they're brought into conscious attention through specific techniques, they become temporarily labeled and can be updated, integrated, or reorganized. Here's the step-by-step mapping process. First, conduct what I call an archetypal inventory by systematically reviewing different areas of your life experience through an archetypal lens. Look at your career and identify which archetypal energies are prominent. Are you primarily operating from hero patterns focused on achievement and success? Creator patterns focused on innovation and expression. Caregiver patterns focused on service and nurturing. Notice which patterns feel natural and energizing versus which feel forced or depleting. Second, examine your relationship history to identify recurring archetypal dynamics. Do you consistently attract partners who embody specific archetypal patterns? Do you find yourself playing the same archetypal roles repeatedly, the rescuer, the rebel, the innocent, the sage? These repetitive patterns reveal both your dominant archetypal identifications and the complementary patterns you're unconsciously seeking through projection onto others. Third, analyze your dreams, fantasies, and creative expressions for archetypal content. The unconscious mind communicates through symbolic language, and dreams provide direct access to archetypal material that might not be visible in ordinary consciousness. Pay attention to recurring dream figures, mythological themes, and symbolic images that appear in your inner life. These are messages from specific archetypal contents that want to be integrated into conscious awareness. Fourth, identify your archetypal shadows, the patterns you resist, judge, or fear in yourself and others. Whatever archetypal energies you strongly react against reveal disowned aspects of your own psychological nature that need integration. If you're judgmental about aggressive or assertive behavior, you might have an underdeveloped warrior archetype. If you're uncomfortable with emotional expression or vulnerability, you might be cut off from lover or child archetypal patterns. Before this integration work, people typically experience themselves as victims of their own psychological patterns, emotions, and behaviors that seem to come from nowhere, motivations they don't understand, reactions they can't control. After systematic archetypal mapping and integration, they report feeling like the conscious directors of their own psychological orchestra, able to recognize which instruments are playing, when harmony and discord occur, and how to create more coherent and beautiful music from their complete psychological resources. The sabotage patterns that prevent successful archetypal integration are predictable and can be addressed systematically. The ego mind resists expansion beyond familiar patterns because change feels threatening to established identity structures. People often experience temporary disorientation as they begin accessing archetypal contents that have been unconscious. This is normal and temporary, like muscle soreness after beginning a new exercise program. The key is proceeding gradually and maintaining grounding practices that help integrate new psychological material without overwhelming existing stability. The fifth and most crucial method involves specific physical practices that activate archetypal energies through embodied action rather than mental analysis alone. The human body contains what I call archetypal memory, physical postures, movement patterns, and somatic responses that directly trigger specific archetypal states. This isn't metaphorical. Neurological research has demonstrated that physical postures and movements activate particular brain networks and hormonal systems that correlate with different psychological states and capabilities. Dr. Amy Cuddy's research on power posing revealed that holding confident physical positions for just 2 minutes increases testosterone and decreases cortisol, creating measurable psychological and behavioral changes. What her research doesn't recognize is that these power poses are actually ancient archetypal postures that humans have used for millennia to embody warrior, leader, and hero energies. The physical form activates the psychological content because body and psyche are integrated systems, not separate entities. You have multiple options for implementing this physical approach. The first option is what I call archetypal movement practices, specific sequences of physical movements that embody different archetypal energies. Ancient cultures understood this principle and created ritual dances, martial arts forms, and ceremonial postures that served as vehicles for archetypal embodiment. You can develop your own movement practices by studying these traditional forms or creating original sequences that feel authentic to your body and your archetypal intentions. The second option is archetypal voice work, using vocal techniques to embody and integrate different archetypal patterns. Each archetype has a characteristic vocal signature. The hero speaks with confidence and determination, the lover with warmth and sensuality, the sage with measured wisdom, the child with spontaneity and wonder. Practicing these different vocal qualities doesn't just change how you sound, it activates the neural networks and psychological states associated with these patterns. The third option is archetypal crafts work, engaging in hands-on creative activities that serve as vehicles for archetypal expression and integration. Woodworking, pottery, gardening, cooking, painting, music making, these activities can become powerful archetypal practices when approached with conscious intention. The creator archetype emerges through archetypistic expression, the builder through construction projects, the nurturer through gardening or cooking. Historical and cultural validation for these physical approaches exists across every traditional society. Indigenous cultures worldwide developed specific body practices for accessing what they called spirit or power, what we now understand as archetypal energies. Shamanic traditions use drumming, dancing, and breathing techniques to induce altered states of consciousness that allow communication with archetypal contents. Martial arts traditions embed archetypal patterns in physical forms. Tiger-style Kung Fu embodies different energies than Crane-style, and practitioners report accessing different psychological capabilities through different forms. The immediate engagement opportunity I want to create for you is this: choose one archetypal pattern that represents something you want to develop more fully in your life. Stand up right now and spend 3 minutes moving your body in ways that feel aligned with this archetypal energy. If you chose the warrior, move with strength and purpose. If you chose the lover, move with grace and sensuality. If you chose the sage, move with deliberate, thoughtful precision. Don't worry about looking right. Focus on feeling the psychological shift that occurs when your body embodies archetypal patterns. This physical action creates momentum because it bypasses the analytical mind that often blocks psychological change. When you move archetypal energy through your body, you're creating new neural pathways and updating your somatic sense of identity in ways that support lasting transformation. The momentum builds because each physical practice reinforces the psychological integration, and each psychological insight makes the physical practices more precise and powerful. Physical engagement is more powerful than mental work alone because trauma, conditioning, and psychological patterns are stored in the body as much as in the mind. You can understand archetypes intellectually and still remain unconsciously possessed by them if you don't address the somatic dimensions of these patterns. But when you engage archetypal energies through physical practice, you're working directly with the embodied intelligence that can transform stuck patterns more rapidly and completely than mental approaches alone. Now, here's the crucial psychological shift that determines whether these methods create lasting transformation or temporary excitement. You must stop seeing yourself as someone who has problems with archetypal forces and start seeing yourself as someone who is learning to establish conscious partnership with the deepest sources of human wisdom and creativity. The victim mentality approaches archetypal work as if these forces are external problems to be solved or managed. The creator mentality recognizes that archetypal energies are actually the raw materials for psychological development and creative expression, not obstacles to overcome, but resources to be cultivated and directed consciously. When you make this identity shift, everything changes. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by unconscious psychological patterns, you feel excited about discovering new dimensions of your capabilities. This isn't positive thinking or motivational rhetoric, it's a fundamentally different relationship to your own psychological nature based on understanding what archetypal forces actually are and how they function. When you recognize that these patterns contain the accumulated wisdom of human experience across millennia, you stop trying to fight against them and start learning to collaborate with them. The certainty you need for successful implementation comes from direct experience, not belief or hope. Every time you practice archetypal embodiment and notice the shift in your psychological state, you're building empirical evidence that these methods work. Every time you identify an archetypal pattern underlying a personal challenge and use that understanding to create a more effective response, you're proving to yourself that this approach has practical value. Your previous attempts at psychological change may have failed because they focused on symptoms rather than archetypal causes, used purely mental approaches that ignored somatic integration, or tried to eliminate problematic patterns rather than transform them into conscious resources. The approaches I'm sharing with you work because they address the actual structure and dynamics of the psyche rather than just its surface manifestations. When you begin implementing these methods, you're not just changing your behavior or improving your emotional state. You're actualizing potentials that have been waiting in your unconscious mind for conscious recognition and integration. This is the difference between self-improvement and individuation. Self-improvement tries to fix what's wrong. Individuation develops what's already present, but undeveloped. What we've explored together today represents a fundamental shift in understanding what human psychological potential actually contains. You've learned that what you thought were personal limitations are actually invitations to develop conscious relationship with archetypal forces that contain tremendous wisdom and capability. You've discovered that the emotional volatility, repetitive patterns, and sense of psychological fragmentation that plague most people aren't signs of personal inadequacy, they're symptoms of unconscious archetypal dynamics that can be transformed through specific knowledge and practice. The moment you begin implementing these methods, you join a small percentage of people who understand that psychological development isn't about fixing what's wrong, it's about actualizing what's already present but unconscious. You become someone who works with the deepest forces in human nature rather than remaining victimized by them. I want to hear specifically about your experience with the physical, archetypal embodiment practice I suggested earlier. Which archetypal energy did you choose to work with? What did you notice in your body during the 3-minute movement practice? And how did your psychological state shift before, during, and after the physical engagement? Share your observations in the comments because your direct experience will help others understand how these principles translate into practical application. Remember, you now possess knowledge that most people will never encounter, let alone understand and apply. The archetypal forces that have been unconsciously controlling your life can become conscious allies in creating the psychological development and meaningful contribution that represent your highest human potential. The choice, as always, is yours.